Ah yes, Mystery Man, and Mr. 1 Kyrie Irving. Confuses defenders on the court and often confuses the public off of it. Maybe he's just misunderstood, but in some effort to understand. We're about to examine his entire career story up to this point. Same way we did for KD and Harden, and I believe Kyrie only makes sense now. The third best player in the NBA's newest trio, but at times what looks like the first option. How did we even get here? Why is he playing next to Kevin Durant today when it once looked like he and LeBron were poised to dominate the Eastern Conference perpetually? Whatever the reason, we're now stuck with three of the sharpest shooters of this generation playing on the same floor. Speaking of shooters, I'd like to thank Frag Pro Shooter for sponsoring today's video. Frag was one of the best mobile shooters last year and looks to continue here with a base of 60 million players and around 1 million users playing every day. Thanks to the link in both the comment section and description, you'll have specific rewards to join them. It's a very simple game. You've got more than 80 characters to collect to create your own deck, build your own strategy, and destroy enemy bunkers with. The game is kept fresh by new content. For instance, the new fragger named Stella. She's just one example of characters that come with new abilities to enhance your experience along the way. Within the game, there are 3 modes to choose from, but I'd recommend going 2-on-2 where you can play with a friend or random partner. You build a team choosing 3 characters from a deck of 6, while your partner gets the other 3 and you compete with 2 other players. This is a game we can play together, maybe even during halftime of our watch parties on stream, and you can do so simply by joining my club. You can also come loaded with the free rewards provided for you thanks to the link in the comment section and description. Looking forward to playing with some of you. 11. Kyrie's current jersey number, but also the number of college games he participated in before being drafted to the big league with the first overall pick at age 19. Fresh off of a toe injury with very little sample size, he was not just being entrusted with eventually becoming the best player of a franchise in shambles. This was the Cleveland Cavaliers, a team that was still dealing with the fresh wounds dealt by LeBron, who'd finally had enough of management's failures to skip town. Luckily, Kyrie would not be stuck with the crushing expectations of winning a title before LeBron's Heat, as owner Dan Gilbert had set forth the summer LeBron left. Nobody outside of Gilbert took that threat seriously. But as with most teams that choose first in the draft, there wasn't an overwhelming amount of talent for Kyrie to work with. Even with the Cavs having a second top 5 pick in this same draft, they would select Tristan Thompson. A bad pick? No, he'd actually play a rather important role down the road. The pick to pair with Kyrie that would have given Cleveland some serious hope in a short time? Nah, they missed that mark by quite a bit, leaving one of the best shooters in history on the table in Klay Thompson, and what would become one of the best two-way players in Kawhi Leonard. Cleveland's woes in surrounding their cornerstone with elite talent were yet again in motion. This was also a lockout-shortened season, meaning processes were moving much quicker than usual, which was something that could easily hinder a rookie. They weren't even allowed to be in NBA 2K12 until the season started in December of that year. Whether one was playing with him in 2K or watching the season though, one thing was for certain, the kid was a beast. On the surface, he put together what was almost and probably should have been a unanimous Rookie of the Year campaign with 19 points, 5.5 assists, while shooting 40% from 3 in only 30 minutes a game. The minutes being low to bring him along slowly in what was a hectic year. Digging deeper, one would find that with per 36 stats, his points per game average came in 9th, and every player in front of him in that category was an all-star. So sure, netting only 2 more wins from the previous season with Antoine Jamison as his second best scorer wasn't all that encouraging, but it was very clear that once he had some formidable weapons around him, the team would at least have the potential to be dangerous. That so often was Cleveland's issue though, right? Formidable weapons around a young superstar. That much was already looking eerie with mispicks Kawhi Leonard playing an important role on a contending Spurs team, and Klay Thompson well on track to become a deadly sharpshooter. Unlike with their previous cornerstone though, they were actually bad enough this time to secure another lottery pick. Unfortunately, that would turn out to be a 4th pick in a draft that only had one clear choice. Winding up with Dion Waiters as a consolation for missing out on Anthony Davis wasn't exactly going to produce any shocking results. That was really the only immediate game changer Cleveland could have taken here, as Bradley Beal went 3rd, and Damian Lillard probably wouldn't have been an ideal pairing with Kyrie. While the draft itself that summer might have been an indication of things to come in the near future, so too was the Team USA camp in which Irving was on the select team, basically meaning he got the scrimmage and practice with the official squad. Not only would he receive high praise from his former college coach, he would directly challenge Kobe Bryant to a game of one-on-one with full-fledged confidence that he could actually take him. This was a 20-year-old sophomore talking to what was still a top 5 player at the time, about to have possibly the best season of his career. If nothing else, that spoke to a level of confidence confidence that would be integral to key moments throughout his own career. It was also an incredible moment with his idol. Also present at that camp was the reigning MVP and first-time Finals MVP LeBron James. Life was good for him in Miami at the moment, and the Heat had a death grip on the Eastern Conference. Irving, with increased minutes, would up his scoring to 23 points a game in 2013, promptly earning himself his first All-Star appearance in only his second year. It did not say much for his team though. Dion Waiters inefficiently stumbled his way to being the second best scorer there, but there wasn't yet much clarity on how the squad would reach Dan Gilbert's hefty expectations. Kyrie and role players simply were not gonna cut it, as he could facilitate, but his gift was clearly scoring. So much so that, during this season, he'd get his chance to go one-on-one with Kobe. He saw the test, the crowd saw the test, and he predictably failed the test after being baited into the banter. But, once again, the splash of irrational confidence that it would take to do some of the things he'd eventually accomplish. Cleveland would only improve by 6 wins, still coming in under 30, with no significant growth out of Irving himself. Speaking of him, he'd only appear in 59 games and missed the end of the season due to a shoulder sprain that would only be one in a long line of injuries throughout his career. He'd missed time as a rookie as well with a fractured finger. Meanwhile, the former Cavalier LeBron James was stacking his second straight title, MVP, and Finals MVP, all while comfortably being the best team in the East and, for the moment, the NBA. It was, however, interesting that he was already approaching the final year of his Miami contract, and despite the overwhelming success, had made no concrete commitment to the team. Also, in another land across the country, all-star big man Kevin Love, like Kyrie Irving, was the cornerstone of an underwhelming situation, his coming mostly through injury to himself and his team. There were clearly some looming changes on the horizon, but nobody could yet be quite sure where it was all headed. Meanwhile, the Cavs were headed back to the lottery for the third straight year since losing LeBron, and for the second of those, another first overall pick. The interesting thing here was that the royal blunder of choosing one of the biggest busts of all time may have played in their favor. Looking at the draft board, many of the players that turned into franchise guys or stars did not do so in a timely manner. So while it's funny that they'd still failed to pair anything of real value with Kyrie, they also didn't necessarily miss anything here either. Anthony Bennett would do absolutely nothing of impact throughout his rookie year, while the Cavaliers were more or less the same team they'd been for Kyrie's entire career now. No playoff aspirations, barely any improvement, and no general direction that anybody could point out. Yet, picking Anthony Bennett would all but assure that they would be right back in the same spot the next year, with what would end up being a very valuable pick. Kyrie was in his third year with no weapons to accentuate his scoring talents, and the lottery wasn't yielding much wealth for the franchise. Luckily enough, the Miami Heat's three-peat efforts would be thwarted by the San Antonio Spurs as they'd claim revenge, stopping what otherwise may have been a Heat dynasty. It's still unclear what LeBron would have done in that situation given how important the Cleveland goal was to his story, but he did give an interview that year saying he couldn't really imagine leaving given the state of where the Heat were at. However, for the time being, Cleveland was eyeing yet another jackpot with their third first overall pick since LeBron left. The difference this time was that the draft housed talent such as Andrew Wiggins and Jabari Parker, which were seen as probable Hall of Fame talents coming out of college. With that pick, they'd select Andrew Wiggins, as there was finally seen to be a clear-cut choice in that draft, but that's not far from when the news broke. After 4 seasons away from home, LeBron announced his return to Cleveland in an attempt to finish what he'd started over a decade ago. He wouldn't promise a title this time, but as a member of the Heat, he'd once speculated on what it would have been like to come back and play in front of those fans again. Although it didn't seem serious at the time, the stars had clearly aligned, regardless of what the results would be. The Heat Big Three had run its course. There was a potential superstar point guard in Kyrie, and a high-value pick just waiting to be moved to complete yet another Big Three. Andrew Wiggins during Summer League professed his excitement in getting ready to play with LeBron, but by that point everyone had seen the writing on the wall, and it's hard to believe that he didn't. He was bait, and there was a disgruntled franchise out there on the hunt. The Minnesota Timberwolves would end their failed experiment with Kevin Love and ship him off to Cleveland in a deal involving Andrew Wiggins. Just like that, with only a couple of faded dominoes falling, the Cavaliers went from perpetual bottom feeders to instant favorites to win the Eastern Conference. Although this would be a different project. Kyrie was instantly thrust from basically just showing up to score in meaningless games into the spotlight of being expected to wield the handles as a point guard of a championship team. Well, his numbers really didn't differ at all from when he was playing by himself, other than becoming a bit more efficient obviously. He showed a willingness to learn, asking Mike Miller in an early game that season if that was what the playoffs felt like. And for the most part, it was pretty smooth sailing after the Cavaliers figured out the rest of the roster, moving pieces like Dion Waiters that clearly didn't fit. The Cavs would finally make a sizable jump, moving up to 53 wins, which was only good enough for second in the conference. Second behind the Atlanta Hawks, also housing losing multiple All-Stars, none of which made All-NBA teams. The only true threat to Cleveland in the East seemed to be the Chicago Bulls with a semi-healthy Derrick Rose. Oh, injuries were also a threat. Kevin Love would only see the first round of the playoffs after having his shoulder pulled out of place by Kelly Olynyk. While this would clearly be a hindrance to their ultimate goal, Kyrie had already shown that his lack of playoff experience meant absolutely nothing, as he posted 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists on 58% true shooting percentage. He averaged that in a sweep of the Boston Celtics, and he more or less looked like the same threat he'd always been up to this point. However, his injuries had also always been a threat, and they'd pop right back up in the second round against Chicago. Hindered by these ailments, his numbers that series would see a steep drop, he'd miss important parts of important games, and LeBron would be forced to completely take over to see the Cavs advance. Spoiler alert, they did. They'd move on to play the Hawks, but Kyrie would only see the floor in 2 of those 4 games, once again forcing LeBron to post nearly a triple-double to take out a team nobody truly believed in to begin with. Again, if any Eastern team was to knock them off, the honor would have belonged to the Bulls. So, in their first season reunited with LeBron, they were back in the NBA Finals mostly by his efforts. Still, Kyrie was said to be ready to play. However, going against the firepower of Golden State with no Kevin Love, and a questionably healthy Kyrie Irving, the Cavs were fighting an obvious uphill battle from the jump, and despite an incredible performance to push the Warriors to the brink in Game 1, Kyrie wasn't going to be jumping too much longer. He gave the reigning MVP and Golden Boy Steph Curry everything he could handle. 23 points, 4 steals, 6 assists, 7 rebounds, all while shooting 45%. If the Cavs were at a disadvantage in this series, you sure couldn't tell it with Kyrie pulling his weight as part of this duo. Steph Curry now had an MVP, had been to the playoffs multiple times, and Kyrie Irving was here in his first postseason, looking like he could have made life miserable that series. We'd never find out though. Irving would bump knees with Klay Thompson, officially putting him out of business for the rest of the series. It then came out that his dad and agent had been upset with the way the team handled his injuries from the start, citing a lack of caution. It was the first time we discovered any semblance of iciness between Irving's camp and the Cavaliers. Whatever the case with that, the task finally became too great for LeBron to conquer without his trio partners, and Cleveland would suffer defeat in the first of many bouts with the Warriors. If they would have at least just had Kyrie, the Cavaliers would have won. That seemed to be the sentiment going into the 2016 season, and nobody ever let it go. That disrespect looked to be a factor in Golden State's historic season. This was where Curry put up shooting numbers the world had never seen, and the Warriors would go on to win 73 games. Meanwhile, the Cavs were just trying to put the pieces back together, once again dealing with Kyrie's injuries as the knee rehabilitation would delay his start to the season. He did make it back for Christmas Day that year, although he wasn't 100%, and the Cavs would narrowly lose. The argument then became that they'd nearly won despite Kyrie only playing around 26 minutes. However, not even a month later, they would be totally taken apart on their home floor, losing the season series to Golden State in a sweep. If nothing else was clear, it wasn't hard to see that only one of these teams had leveled up in any significant way since their meeting in the finals, and a rematch would likely yield the same results. Kyrie's numbers for the season were down a bit, and he obviously missed the All-Star team for the first time since his rookie year, given that he was on a minutes restriction. Yet, Cleveland was still clearly the best team in the East, winning nearly 60 games and having no true challenger to fear given the decline of the Chicago Bulls. With the chains off for the postseason, Kyrie would immediately pick up where he left off the last time he was healthy, becoming the leading scorer in the first round against the Pistons at 27 points a game. He'd put up an efficient 21-6 in another sweep against the Atlanta Hawks, and would once more be a great compliment to LeBron as they dispatched up the Raptors in 6. However, none of these opponents stacked up against what they'd be facing in the finals, and with the Pistons series being closer than it looked, while the Raptors had actually pushed them to 6, they were expected to get exposed. But on the West side, Curry had seen multiple injuries in the first round that significantly fanned the flames he'd been dishing out the entire season. He no longer cut the same, he struggled to push out the same performances he'd once displayed with ease, so there were at least some differences in this team versus what they'd seen in the regular season, especially after only narrowly defeating an amazing OKC team, having to come back from 3-1 to do it. It didn't seem like it would be a problem though, as the Warriors expectedly pulled away in their first 2 home games, and what looked like it was headed to be an anticlimactic ending to this rematch. That would have been horrible, by the way, considering everybody spent the year saying the Warriors couldn't win that matchup healthy. Back at home, Cleveland was only able to split the games, leaving them in an impossible 3-1 deficit against a team that had conquered every challenge in front of them throughout the season. Not to mention that Kevin Love was again hurt, making him a virtual non-factor for most of the rest of the series. There wasn't even the slightest chance they couldn't win more than 1 game against this Cavs team they dominated the entire year now. The only glimmer of hope being that Draymond had reached his technical foul threshold and would miss the closeout Game 5 in Oracle. This was where both Kyrie and LeBron would put up 41 points in a shocking victory that totally shifted the momentum of the series. It was written on both their faces. If nobody else in the world thought Cleveland had what it took, LeBron and Kyrie did, and they took turns putting daggers in what the Warriors hoped would turn into a celebration. Andrew Bogut, the defensive anchor for the Warriors, also sustained a series-ending injury, cracking the door open even further. Game 6 in Cleveland would be a rout, Kyrie being the second leading scorer, while LeBron again pushed out 41 points to force Game 7. To this point, when things mattered, Kyrie had been outdoing the unanimous MVP, and that wouldn't change in Game 7. Curry would struggle mightily, turning the ball over with abysmal shooting. Meanwhile, Kyrie was on his way to 26 points and 6 assists while getting ready to execute in one of the most important moments in NBA history. The one thing we learned about Kyrie to this point was that he was both clutch and fearless, whether his team was on its way to a tanking season or the most important moment in a playoff series. So it was no surprise that when it was all on the line, he didn't even hesitate to take Curry one-on-one, who Golden State had been trying to hide defensively, by the way, for the ultimate dagger. Sure, the Warriors had time, but anybody watching could see that it was over from that moment. Cleveland had pulled off the greatest comeback of all time. Kyrie hitting at worst the second best final shot in NBA history. Maybe he hadn't had playoff experience before LeBron, maybe he wouldn't win without him, but he proved beyond any doubt that he was built for the big stages. Yet, perhaps missing that shot and losing that series might have been better for the immediate future? Probably not, but the events that spawned from it ironically set the end of this partnership in motion. The Warriors losing allowed Kevin Durant to feel comfortable joining them that very offseason, and no matter how great Kyrie and LeBron could be in a single game, they'd never be able to sustain it long enough to beat this juggernaut in a series. Furthermore, the wheels were already unstable in Cleveland. Kyrie would later admit that after hitting the shot, he wasn't as emotionally invested in the moment as he should have been. He was just thinking, quote, what's next? He also reportedly chose to FaceTime his idol Kobe Bryant while his team celebrated one of history's best titles. His reaction to this once-in-a-generation moment may have been the first clues into how he truly views basketball, and maybe even sheds light on why things unfolded the way they did shortly after. Christmas Day 2016 would be the last time Cleveland seemed to have the upper hand on the Warriors, Kyrie once again snatching their hearts out with a dagger that tricked some into thinking there may still have been hope. The 2017 Cavaliers were likely the best version Kyrie and LeBron led, easily sweeping their way through an ever-deteriorating Eastern Conference on their way to a third straight title match with the Warriors. However, as shown in their matchup that Martin Luther King Day, Cleveland's defense had slipped a little bit too far to compete in a series like this, even if they were jaw-dropping offensively with some of their additions. The Warriors would make quick work of the series, extracting their revenge in 5, even if it felt totally ruined by the addition of KD. Somewhere around that time, a story had dropped covering that Kyrie had talked to Kobe Bryant about avoiding a Shaq-like feud with LeBron James so that they could continue to prosper. It was interesting because we'd never seen anything overtly negative between the two. Maybe a bench moment during a close game where Kyrie seemed stubborn, but absolutely nothing hinting at a future breakup, or that he was even bothered by the Shadow LeBron cast. As a matter of fact, during that 2017 season, Irving posted a career high in scoring at 25 a game, clearly signaling that he was the focal point of the offense to give LeBron a bit of a break as he began to age. With that method, it seemed like Kyrie could offensively be the number one and take on more of the load, while also assuring this Cavs team wouldn't lose its grip on the East anytime soon. Yet, Cleveland was also financially strapped, totally committed to the roster they had, with little to no room for improvement. To compete with the Warriors in a series, who looked like they weren't going away anytime soon, they needed a lot of improvement. Unfortunately for the morale of the team, that improvement seemed that it may have come by trading Kyrie Irving in a deal for Paul George. That was just one of many that were discussed. To this day, it's unclear if that's exactly what triggered Kyrie to ask for a trade, as it all happened so suddenly. Maybe other things contributed, like the time a reporter asked him what type of father figure LeBron James was to he and the team. Maybe LeBron getting all the credit for the team's success actually did matter. And if it turned out that the team saw him as expendable, despite him being a great number 2, maybe it was time for him to go do his own thing. There was also no concrete commitment from LeBron James, who was now in the last year of his deal with the Cavaliers, and he'd been signing short ones to stay there, so we never really knew if he was in or out. Given the situation of the team and the fact that there was no chance they would ever be better than the Warriors, it was starting to seem rather predictable that LeBron James would take his talents elsewhere for a second time. And given the Cavaliers' track record with Kyrie Irving before LeBron arrived, it's hard to believe that even if he wanted to do his own thing, that he wanted to do it with a organization that clearly was not going to get them the proper talent. Thus, he would now request a trade and be dealt to the Boston Celtics, who'd also just signed All-Star Gordon Hayward. What was better? Irving's former team hadn't exactly improved the way they'd hoped for in this deal. They'd made plenty of additions, but the roster more or less looked like a ragtag job of injured or past his prime players surrounding LeBron and Kevin Love. So while the Warriors still held their monopoly over the NBA, the East had loosened up a bit and become a bit more unclear as time would show. Kyrie was now tasked with leading a team, a totally different environment, along with Hayward on a roster with young and upcoming stars. It was the challenge he'd willingly accepted. The first hindrance to said goal was his co-star Hayward going down with a brutal ankle injury at the very beginning of opening night. From that moment, their contending hopes were already said to be over. Kyrie would also airball the game-tying shot down the stretch in front of LeBron and enter a rather awkward embrace with the former co-star as they went their separate ways to begin the year. It's easy to forget now that despite the doom of that night, Kyrie went on to lead Boston quite well in his first year as captain, including a massive winning streak and rumblings that they were very much a contender to go to the finals. This, of course, with the help of younger players such as Jason Tatum. With what had already been a recurring theme, Kyrie's injuries would ruin that. His knee became troublesome, he sat out, and it was announced he wouldn't be making a return in 2018. It was a shame too, because he was molding that squad in his vision and doing quite well at it. His subsequent absence gave a bigger role to the younger stars and role players such as Terry Rozier. When it was all said and done, even without him, Boston had made it within one win of the NBA Finals, very nearly dethroning LeBron James and his roster that had been reworked in a panic mid-season. This, however, did not bring about the talk that the Celtics were better without Irving. As a matter of fact, it caused people to believe they'd have likely made the finals with him, and even challenged the Warriors maybe, as he consistently gave them problems during the season and was even seen as somewhat of a kryptonite to Steph. As we would come to learn though, both Kyrie and Hayward's absence on a team that found its way without them was more of a death sentence. When they returned, the hierarchy was completely ruffled. Guys who were used to certain shots were thrown out of rhythm when relegated to their previous roles, teammates clashed, and what was supposed to be a 60+ win team struggled to win 49. What made things worse was that LeBron James had promptly left the Eastern Conference, leaving the door wide open for multiple teams that had just hit their contending phase. Navigating that season was also tricky because of Kyrie's free agency situation. He began the year by assuring a crowd in Boston that he was there to stay and ready to sign. The expiring deal was supposed to mean nothing, although Boston had taken that risk trading for him in the first place. Yet, as the team was falling well short of its expectations, his answers on his future there became more and more vague, which wasn't helped by his tunnel talk with Kevin Durant that All-Star weekend. Although the Warriors were still winning, Durant too had said nothing concrete about his future, and rumors were beginning to fly about a potential pairing between the two in New York. It also didn't help that Kyrie openly admitted that season that he'd called LeBron James, and apologized for giving him a hard time with the position of leadership he was in, saying he now understood that it was much more difficult than it looked. Not exactly the kind of thing you just tell the media while the people you're talking about are back in the locker room after a tough loss. Honestly, if they'd just been able to build from where they were in the first year, the Celtics might have been special with Kyrie, but the talent there grew into each other instead of with each other. So when they were manhandled by the Bucks in round 2, there were no real surprises. Kyrie himself played terrible that series, seeming somewhat disinterested by the end and obviously checked out. If absolutely nothing else was clear about the Celtics' future, it was known that it did not involve him. Meanwhile, the Warriors had worked through their chemistry problems enough to make a third straight finals with KD, where he'd tear his Achilles upon rejoining the team. This further confused the future destinations of either him or Kyrie. Irving would promptly move on from Boston as soon as free agency opened, inking a deal with the Brooklyn Nets instead of the Knicks. It wasn't a sure thing KD was about to follow, but he did, along with DeAndre Jordan, as we would later learn they discussed this pairing years earlier. Thus, the NBA's next duo era was born, or so we thought. KD and Kyrie, two of the NBA's most difficult media personalities on the same team. Mysterious guys with thoughts that often transcended basketball. Sadly, we knew from the jump it was at least a year away, as Durant was not returning until he was fully healed. This made for a bit of an awkward season, as Nets fans would have to hold their breath hoping Kyrie didn't sustain a serious injury before they got to see him take the floor next to Durant. Fortunately, he would see an injury that would knock him out for the season without actually altering his career. The stage was set for a possible takeover in 2021. Tragically, during the previous season though, Kyrie's idol Kobe Bryant would pass without warning. The man he would seek out for advice throughout his career. The man he would call during the most sacred moment of his career. The legend he challenged to one-on-one at the ripe age of 20. We were all, and still are, devastated by this loss, but Kyrie truly lost a friend, a mentor of sorts. He would refuse to play the day the news broke, and it was one of the last times we saw him that season. The way he handled it was just one of many times we saw matters off the court matter to him more than what took place on it. The very human side of Kyrie, the one that's donated to multiple social causes, the side that did not not want to see the NBA's bubble take place during a very turbulent time in the country. He'd said in 2018 that he wanted to retire in his early to mid-30s, and it's not entirely wrong to wonder if we've been witnessing the beginning to the end of his career this year. He's a complicated guy, so we don't exactly know what it means when he disappears from his team with no explanation for weeks. We don't exactly know what it is that he wants out of his basketball career when maybe it's just not the most important thing in his life. But the one thing we've never been able to question is the talent, which is why his newly fomented Big Three is amongst the most feared. Sure, they're not good at defense. It's currently unclear what he and Harden will look like on the court together at their best, but their roster is now only a few tweaks away from being far too much for any team to handle. And the feeling is that they'll figure that part out either this season or the next, and when they do, it'll probably mean another championship for Kyrie Irving. But will that fulfill him? He clearly still cares, as his latest Instagram rant showed, where he declared that they'd be on the biggest stage, that the people who couldn't do would be watching. However, winning with this Nets team and without LeBron won't exactly answer the questions he seemed to set out for when moving on from the Cavs to do his own thing. He's still engaged in the game, last summer expressing how much he loved the idea of playing with Kevin Durant, calling him the first teammate that could make the same shots as him, a declaration LeBron did not appreciate. We might see it all come to a head in the 2021 NBA Finals. Both his career and public thoughts have been a total roller coaster up to this point, and there's no telling what the story will look like when the ride is finished.